All right. Hi again, everyone. Thanks so much for attending the workshop. I really appreciate you giving me 2 hours of your time, especially on a Friday night. Again, I want to say a big thank you to Bria Miller for inviting me to do this and to the Khyber for having me. And I do want to give a shout out to James Spooner. Some of the subjects touched on in this presentation are explored more in depth in his 2003 film Afropunk, which I would urge anybody watching this to also check out. Again, there's some pretty strong language used at certain points within this presentation, mostly one specific slur that I'll be saying when quoting people or song lyrics. You can likely figure out which word I'm alluding to. And I just wanted to give a quick disclaimer about that. Black lives matter, have always mattered, and will always matter. And I do hope that my little presentation could spark a little joy during such a turbulent time. The name of this presentation is Black Dots, and the name signifies a couple of things. Firstly, I appreciate the kind of imagery the title conjures up. Being a young Black kid navigating a music scene dominated by white people often left me feeling kind of like a dot, fairly insignificant. I think there's something to be said for how often people of color can feel like they're drowning amongst a sea of white people, and I like how the title reflects that. Secondly, as some of you may know, Black Dots is also the title of a record by an extremely important band called the Bad Brains. I'll certainly be talking about them a bit later on. Black Dots isn't really a proper album, but rather a document of one of the band's first known recording sessions. They recorded at the house of a guy named Don Zientara, who's still making punk records in Washington, D.C. at a place called Inner Ear Studios. Each band member tracked their instrument in a different part of the house during the session. I believe the drummer was in the basement, the bass player was in a bathroom, and the guitar player was in the attic or something like that. The band's singer, Paul Hudson, otherwise known as HR, recorded his vocals right outside the back door in Don's backyard. In between some of the songs on the record, you can actually hear little kids from the neighborhood talking to HR, trying to figure out why this lone Black dude was screaming into a microphone outside with no one else around. As I mentioned, this is one of the band's earliest recordings. I think it's their second ever, and it wasn't really intended to be heard by many people. I don't think the band considered it especially reflective of what they were capable of, but they were keen to get something on tape. It was released several years after it was first recorded, and the record has since become a legendary release for this band. This is a fairly good analogy for many of the people that I'm going to be discussing in this presentation. A lot of these folks are considered background players in the history of punk and hardcore music, whose contributions to the art form are largely inconsequential. I would argue that a lot of the people I'll be talking about played a substantial role in helping to shape this music into what we understand it to be today. In order to better understand the significance of Black people in punk, it's important to first analyze why it is that punk, or really any form of rock music, was understood to be something intended for a white audience by the time punk rock became a household term. Why is the rock music scene not a welcoming place for Black people? This is an especially puzzling question when we look at the forefathers and mothers of rock and roll music. There's very little debate that African Americans are largely responsible for creating what we understand to be rock music. Many people are quick to cite Chuck Berry as one of the originators of rock music. Similar credit is often given to Little Richard, and many people who have taken a deeper dive into the origins of rock music will be quick to tell you that one of the undeniable originators is Sister Rosetta Tharpe. So when we look back on the people we have to thank for the creation of this music, we see contributors who are Black, gay, and female. And yet, rock music to this day is still so often communicated and understood to be a white, macho, misogynistic, heteronormative phenomenon. Why? It will probably not come as a shock that I believe the root of this problem to be inherent within Elvis Presley's rise to fame. I was not really that old when I first heard about Elvis supposedly remarking, "Niggers are only good for two things, shining my shoes and buying my records." I have no way of knowing whether he actually said or believed this, and to be honest, my quarrel is not so much with Elvis as it is with the music industry. That is, the record industry who used Elvis to sell records, specifically using a white face to sell Black music to a white audience. By the time Elvis was popular, rock music was quite popular with white listeners, but many of those listeners had no interest in owning records by Black artists. Elvis set an unfortunate precedent. it was soon him, not Chuck Berry or Little Richard, who became considered the godfather of rock and roll, and the initial steps toward the whitewashing of rock music culture were taken. It wasn't long before many other white artists started creating rock music. Great rock music, I might add, but with the unfortunate side effect of widening the roster of white rock acts to the point where it was easy to forget the intrinsic connection between rock and roll and African-American culture. Things became so bad that by the time Jimi Hendrix became a well-known artist, only a few short years later, really, he was cited as an ambassador for rock music to the Black community. This is especially ludicrous when you consider the fact that Hendrix did time playing in Little Richard's backing band. He was there from the beginning and knew the roots of rock music better than most. I apologize since the name of the song escapes me, but there's a B-side of Hendrix's which contains the lyrics, "They told me don't come back until you're really black," reflecting on the criticism Jimi Hendrix regularly took as a result of the way his music sounded and who he kept company with. The first video I want to show is a pretty good encapsulation of some of what I'm talking about, despite the fact that it's very corny. And I'm not going to play all of it. I'm just going to play a couple of key parts, but it's Run DMC's video for the song King of Rock. So hopefully this works out right. I'm just going to try and share it. All right, I think you probably get the point. I'm going to go back to the slideshow now. Here we go. All right. Hannah and Bria, let me know if I'm messing any of this up. It's
No, you got it.
Everything's going okay?
Yeah, you're doing great.
Perfect. All right. It's high time I started actually talking about punk, so let's talk about it. Let's fast forward to 1977. Elvis dies, and the Sex Pistols, pictured here, along with many other notable bands, are gaining popularity and associated with a new musical movement known as punk. Some of the earliest fans and supporters of these bands in London were a group known as the Bromley Contingent. A lot of punks who would later rise to fame were members of this group, including Susie Sue of Susie and the Banshees, who you can see on the left, and even Billy Idol. A lesser known member of this group is a Black woman named Simone Thomas, pictured here. Perhaps the most notable moment for both the Bromley Contingent and the Sex Pistols is the Pistols' appearance on a really hokey afternoon tea time show hosted by a man named Bill Grundy. I have a video clip of this appearance that will reveal why it resulted in the instant infamy of both the band and the contingent, but it's Simone's inclusion in the video that I find the most interesting. From 1977 onwards, punk rock has been seen as something largely intended for white men. Yet the first public television appearance ever of punk rockers, and there aren't many of them, includes a Black woman. So again, I'm just going to try and play a clip of that right now.
They are punk rockers. The new craze, they tell me. They're heroes, not the nice, clean Rolling Stones. You see, they are as drunk as I am. They are clean by comparison. They're a group called the Sex Pistols. And I'm surrounded now by all of them. Just let us see the Sex Pistols in action. I am told that that group have received £40,000 from a record company. Doesn't that seem to be slightly opposed to their anti-materialistic view of life?
No, the more the merrier.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Well, tell me more about it.
We fucking spent it, haven't we?
I don't know, have you?
Yeah. It's all gone.
Really?
Down the boozer.
40, really? Good Lord. Now, I want to know one thing.
What?
Are you serious, or are you just trying to make me laugh?
Gone.
Really?
Yeah.
No, but I mean about what you're doing.
Oh, yeah.
You are serious?
Mm.
Beethoven, Mozart, Bach and Brahms have all died.
Ours, aren't they?
Really?
Yes.
What are we saying, sir?
Wonderful people.
Are they?
Oh yes, they really turn us on.
What they do?
Well, suppose they turn other people on.
That's just their tough tricks.
Which one?
Nothing. A rude word. Next question.
No. What was the rude word?
Shit.
Was it really? Good heavens, you frightened me to death.
Oh, all right. So
What about you girls behind?
He's like your dad, isn't he, this geezer?
Are you,
Or your granddad.
are you worried, or are you just enjoying yourself?
Enjoying myself.
Are you?
Yeah.
That's what I thought you were doing.
Always wanted to meet you.
Did you really?
Yeah.
We'll meet afterwards, shall we?
Yeah.
You dirty sod. You dirty old man.
Well, keep going, Chick, keep going. Go on, you've got another 5 seconds. Say something
You
outrageous.
dirty bastard.
Go on, again.
You dirty fucker.
What a clever boy.
What a
Yeah.
fucking rotter.
Well, that's it for tonight. The other rocker, Abel, and I'm saying nothing else about him, will be back tomorrow. I'll be seeing you soon. I hope I'm not seeing you again. From me, though, good night.
Aside from Simone, there were a lot of other important Black figures involved in the punk scene at this time. And one of the most influential people I can think of in the entire world of punk is the man pictured here, Don Letts. Don used to DJ at a lot of the same clubs that early English punk bands would play at. Don liked punk, but is also an enormous reggae fan and would spin reggae records from his own collection in between bands. By doing so, Don introduced a predominantly white English audience to authentic Jamaican dub music. Now, there are a lot of Jamaican immigrants in England, and I'm sure that many of these white punk kids were at the very least familiar with reggae and dub, but there's no question that Don whet the appetite of those showgoers in particular. There is an intrinsic connection between punk and reggae music that exists to this day. A lot of notable punk bands have experimented with reggae and ska, including some particularly bad bands from the 90s who I need not mention. And to an outsider, such a connection is extremely confusing. It can be traced 100% back to Don Letts. Don is also an avid videographer and captured a lot of early footage of the Sex Pistols, the Clash, and many other early English punk bands. He greatly influenced the art direction of the latter band and is one of the major reasons why the artwork on so many of their records reflects that of reggae records from just a few years prior. Don is also the original singer of one of the very first punk bands ever to include Black membership, the band Basement 5. I would encourage anyone interested to seek out their music online, specifically their Last White Christmas single. I think the band is quite good, but I may be a little biased. The mid to late 70s is often remembered as a time when punk bands were more original and experimental. When punk was in its infancy, bands tended to craft their own sound more than trying to imitate what their peers were doing. A prime example of this is the English band X-Ray Spex. The band incorporated a saxophone into their sound, which gave their music somewhat of a more traditional rock and roll vibe. But there was nothing traditional about the band's singer, Marianne Joan Elliott Said, better known as Polystyrene. A young biracial woman who was raised by a single white mother, it was Polly who formed X-Ray Spex after seeing the Sex Pistols live and being inspired to start a band. As far as the early days of punk go, Polly is one of, if not the first, female frontperson of a punk band. And shortly after X-Ray Spex rose to prominence in England, a lot more female participants in the punk scene started becoming visible. I feel Polly deserves praise not only for encouraging more women and people of color to get involved in that music scene, but also for bringing something particularly unique to the table. Noted as an especially unconventional performer, no one else looks like Polly and no one sounds like her. Don't take my word for it though. Let's watch a short video of the band performing. With the end of the 70s came a new English music scene, somewhat born out of the initial punk scene that was kind of wrapping up at this point. And that would be the ska revival scene. Impossible without the groundwork laid by Don Letts. A band known as the Specials were at the forefront of this new scene, which also somewhat revolved around their record label, Two Tone Records. Racial unity is a prevalent theme within the band's lyrics, aesthetic, and appearance. Comprised of both Black and white members, the band primarily dressed only in the colors black and white to make a statement. I'm quite a big fan of this band and praise them not only for the music they made, but the work they put into spreading the message of acceptance and inclusion across England at that time. However, it's important to note that the band, label, and scene surrounding it was perhaps not as inclusive as it prided itself on being, given that it was largely a boys' club. That all changes with the addition of this woman, Pauline Black. Pauline sang for a two-tone records band called The Selector, who along with the Specials and Madness are credited the most with leading the English ska revival. After the Selectors start making a name for themselves, more women become involved in this particular music scene, including the women who would comprise the full membership of the two-tone band, the Body Snatchers, and the women who would later join members of the Specials to help reform that band into a band known as the Special AKA. Much like Polystyrene, Pauline Black was a Black woman raised by white parents who took on a moniker. Her real name is actually Belinda Magnus, but she was given the name Pauline Vickers by the white couple who adopted her. Pauline adopted the stage name Black as somewhat of a way to stick it to the people who adopted her. Throughout her entire childhood, they never referred to her as Black, only as colored. She is a dynamic performer in her own right, and I'd be remiss not to include a video of the selector performing at this point. And this is probably one of the last videos for a little while. I've spent a good amount of time talking about what was happening in England during this time period, but there were a lot of important American musicians and tastemakers active at the same time who should be acknowledged. The first all-Black American proto-punk band, if you will, was a band very near and dear to my heart called Death. There's a great documentary on the band simply entitled A Band Called Death that I would encourage everyone to see. However, the first all-Black punk band in my mind is a band from Philadelphia called Pure Hell, pictured here. Pure Hell's music has a very sleazy rock and roll sound with a lot of elements shared by bands like the Sex Pistols and the Dead Boys, who they were friends with. The tragedy of Pure Hell's story comes mainly as a result of their relationship with a man named Curtis Knight, who was their manager. Knight had previously worked with Jimi Hendrix and was of the opinion that Hendrix's best bet at selling records was to be marketed as something of a novelty act. The thought being that white people would buy Hendrix records to see this strange interpretation of their music performed by a Black person. Knight tried to manage Pure Hell in exactly this way. He thought that a white audience would find the idea of a Black punk rock band so ludicrous that they would buy a Pure Hell record for a laugh. For this and many other reasons, he and the band got into some fiery disputes. They had recorded and released one single at this point, which was a cover of Nancy Sinatra's These Boots Are Made for Walking. Having only this white artist's cover as a release, the band went into the studio and recorded an excellent full-length record called Noise Addiction. However, due to their extremely fractured relationship with Curtis Knight, he walked out on the band and took the master tapes of that record with him. As a result, Noise Addiction would not be released until almost 30 years later, when the tapes were recovered. Much like Pure Hell before them, the band ESG have had to deal with a great deal of disrespect over a long period of time, but in a very different way. ESG stands for Emerald, Sapphire, and Gold, and the band is comprised mainly of four sisters, family named Scroggins, and their friend Tito. ESG really had no aims of being lumped in with the punk or new wave scene when they formed. They just wanted to play some funk. However, the band's approach towards their music really could not be more punk rock, in my opinion. They did not have the chops nor the equipment to emulate their favorite funk bands, but they decided to play anyway. A lot of their early material is comprised only of bass, vocals, and percussion. That's it. It was this kind of stripped down approach to the music they intended to play that gave what they were doing kind of a proto-punk or dance punk feel and caught the attention of Factory Records, which is home to Joy Division and many other notable bands. When recording the material for their first self-titled EP, the band ended up recording, oh, I'm sorry, folks. Okay. My apologies, everybody. Okay, here we go. So sorry about that. When recording the material for the first self-titled EP, the band ended up recording a song called UFO, mostly because their producer had 3 minutes left on the master tape during the session and encouraged them to do so. The song has not only gone on to become synonymous with this band, but is now one of, if not the most sampled song of all time. UFO was well known amongst DJs during the golden era of hip hop and has been sampled in songs by TLC, Tricky, the Wu-Tang Clan, you name it. For 20 years, this band received little to no compensation from anyone as a result of these samples being used. This led to the title of another EP the band released in 1992, Sample Credits Don't Pay Our Bills. But something very interesting happens to punk rock at the beginning of the 80s, and it's an important transition that bridged punk with what would later come to be known as hardcore punk. I realize how silly and arbitrary this sounds, but there are some important differences between the two that are worth exploring. On the left, you can see a couple of early LA punk bands, namely X and the Screamers, who were part of the initial wave of American punk. And these kind of bands played a strange derivation of rock music, sometimes layered with synthesizers and other elements like strange vocals or subject matter to help distinguish themselves from the rock acts of the day. For this reason, bands like Devo are often considered part of this initial wave. By 1980, a lot of American punk bands, especially in California, had adopted a very different aesthetic. The music became faster and much more aggressive. and the synthesizers and experimentation had all but disappeared. There's a notable shift in the drumming between those early bands and these new harder edged ones. The tempo is faster and technical proficiency starts playing more of a role, especially when it comes to drum fills. I picture here a couple of my favorite drummers from this era, Spit Sticks from the band Fear on the bottom, and then on the right, Chuck Biscuits, who's played in DOA, Black Flag, Circle Jerks, Danzig, the list goes on, probably my favorite drummer of all time. As a result of this new style of punk rock, shows become much more macho, aggressive, and violent. Emphasis on violent. The boots you see here belong to a group of showgoers in Huntington Beach, California, known as the HBs, who set a new standard for the level of violence experienced at punk shows and influenced the greater North American punk scene in the way people danced, dressed, and acted at shows. This new scene was dominated by white American men, and in particular, a lot of very scary muscle-bound skinheads. I think this is pretty ironic, since this shift in musical style can somewhat be attributed to a Black woman, Carla Duplantier, who played drums in a band called the Controllers during this stylistic shift in punk rock. The Controllers had a couple of drummers before Carla, but they didn't really get anywhere until she joined. Carla quickly whipped these boys into shape, getting them better shows, radio airplay, and much more. It's important to note that Carla was an excellent rock drummer, and in my opinion, greatly influenced the new direction of punk drumming, which in turn influenced the prevalent style of punk bands during this period. Perhaps the most legendary LA punk band is a band called The Germs, who left behind one of the most revered punk records ever, GI. When recording the sessions that resulted in that record, drummer Don Bowles either did not wish to use his own gear or possibly did not have any gear to use at that time. He was quick to borrow a full drum kit from a friend to record with, and that friend was Carla. So I'm just about at the halfway mark for my slide deck for this presentation, and without taking anything away from all of the other brilliant artists I want to shine a light on, I have to admit that the greatest musical legacy left behind of any of the people I'll be discussing tonight is that of the Bad Brains from Washington, DC. I do not have nearly enough time to recount all the ways this band changed the face of music and my life forever, but I'll do my best to focus on the most important points. Firstly, I think it's interesting that the Bad Brains, much like ESG, who I recently mentioned, are steeped in a musical tradition much more closely associated with Black people. They initially were something of a funk and jazz fusion band called Mind Power, which included second guitarist Sid McRae. Members of the band were familiar with a musical movement specific to the Black community in DC known as go-go music, which still exists today and is pretty incredible if you ever get a chance to hear it. And bassist Daryl Jennifer played in an Earth, Wind, and Fire cover band prior to joining Mind Power. I mention all this to kind of set the tone for what it was like for a band of Black men from DC and Maryland to adopt punk rock. Sid McRae was intrigued by a Sex Pistols single he saw at a local record store, so he bought it and played it for the band. It wasn't long before all band members had fallen in love with punk, but they were still hesitant to try and play it in front of an audience, knowing that the optics would be pretty unusual. A major influence on the band and catalyst for them to come out of their shells a bit was the band Pure Hell. Seeing other Black punk rockers making music to satisfy themselves, regardless of what the general public thought about it, was a major force for the Bad Brains. And this very much aligns with a major principle of Afrocentricity, especially Afrocentric education. Seeing others who look like you involved in something will naturally make you more comfortable to try that thing for yourself. When the Bad Brains first started playing out locally, they were immediately noticeable. People were a bit shocked to see a group of Black guys playing fast punk music for sure, but there were other important factors that helped the Bad Brains stand out. One was their sheer musicality. I mean, this band could play. Remember, these are guys who spent years before this playing complicated jazz. They all knew their way around their instruments to a very impressive extent, something quite unusual for a punk rock band. Being fairly virtuosic at their instruments compelled the Bad Brains to push the limits of what punk could sound like. Instead of the sloppy three-chord punk rock people had become accustomed to, Bad Brains played at a breakneck speed while also exhibiting stop-on-a-dime precision. Punk audiences just simply had not ever seen anything like them before. Another memorable feature of the band was the prowess and impressive stage presence of frontman HR. It's probably best for me to actually provide some evidence of what I'm talking about at this point, so I am going to play a quick video of the band performing in their infancy back in 1979. Keep an eye out for HR's full backflip about a minute into the video. Musically, the Bad Brains are known for essentially creating hardcore punk, and that's a type of punk rock that is especially fast and incorporates certain dynamics in the music. But another major reason they're looked on so fondly is because of what they did to encourage those around them. On the right-hand side of the screen is a young Henry Rollins fronting his first band, State of Alert. And for those familiar, you'll know Henry Rollins has gone on to have an exceptional career and has all but become a household name, really. But he never picked up a microphone until HR from the Bad Brains told him he should become a singer. Pictured on the left is an early DC hardcore band called the Teen Idols. Members of this band would go on to form a hardcore band whose legacy is arguably rivaled only by that of the Bad Brains. That's a band called Minor Threat. It's important to remember the influence the Bad Brains had on them. They initially were a punk band called the Slinkies, but they sharpened and tightened their sound after seeing the Bad Brains. At one point in time, the Bad Brains and Teen Idols shared a practice space. And by practice space, I mean someone's parents' basement. Someone in the Teen Idols, that is. When the Teen Idols were through rehearsing, the Bad Brains would come over and have their band practice while the Teen Idols watched in awe. The Bad Brains exhibition encouraged the Teen Idols to become better players, and the Bad Brains took time to help the Teen Idols get better at their instruments. One of the reasons I have such immense respect for the Bad Brains is the strides the band took to connect with their own community. As some of you may be aware, Washington, D.C. is one of the most racially segregated cities in America, especially during the time period that I'm focusing on. Washington is a majority Black city, so much so that it was known as the Chocolate City between the 60s and the 90s, roughly. However, it would be difficult to realize that given the part of the city that you're in. Washington is actually divided into 8 wards, and that's to this day. Ward 1, where the fashionable shopping district is and the affluent children of senators and politicians would go to see the Bad Brains play, is majority white. If you go all the way down the list to Ward 8, you find an impoverished community with buildings in a state of disrepair. Population, 91% Black. The Bad Brains felt it incumbent upon themselves to at least play a few shows in Ward 8, to at least attempt to connect with their own community and turn them on to the music scene they had fallen in love with. The images I'm showing you right now are from a show the band played in the Valley Green Housing Project, which is of course located in Ward 8. I hope I don't come across as too crass by saying this, but the best Haligonian analogy I can give for what the Bad Brains did is to imagine that an all-Black punk band that was crucial to a youth music scene that had developed in the Point Pleasant area, at some point along the way decides to start playing shows in Uniacke Square. It's worth noting that a lot of the Black youth who went to see the Bad Brains perform at these shows in Ward 8 appreciated the spectacle of what they were seeing, but did not necessarily enjoy the band's music. However, the Bad Brains did encourage Black youth in the DC area to pick up instruments and form bands, setting off a chain reaction where Black musicians in one wave of the music scene continued to inspire future Black musicians who would have bands in the next oncoming wave of that scene. Each one teach one. This brings to mind a very fondly remembered figure in the DC hardcore scene, Tony Young. Tony was a participant in that scene, someone who was just a genuine fan of the bands and was keen to promote upcoming shows. It wasn't long, though, before Tony was inspired to play in a band, and she ended up being the bassist for a great DC hardcore band called Red Sea. They never really had a proper release, but they do have 4 songs featured on the Flex Your Head compilation. Like some other Black women I've mentioned, Tony's participation in this music scene inspired other women to get involved. It's also worth mentioning that DC was known to have an especially aggressive scene at this time. Henry Rollins and the Teen Idols took in a few shows in California in 1980 and were inspired to dance hard after watching What the HBs could do. They brought that back with them to DC, and things got pretty rough and tough in that scene as a result, to the point where punk guys from DC were labeled as muscleheads who were quick to fight. The Flex Your Head compilation is so named as a parody of that label. Tony deserves a lot of credit for seeing past the macho bullshit to hold on to things she loved about that scene. There's a legendary gig the Bad Brains organized in DC to showcase all the new bands and up-and-coming talent in the city at that time. It was one of the first shows Minor Threat ever played, as well as State of Alert and many others. 15 bands played the show in total, but there was only one woman who performed music that night. It was Tony. Tony is especially significant to me because she's literally one of the first Black people I ever clearly saw involved in and enjoying punk rock. I had spent tons of time listening to and reading about the Bad Brains in my early teens, but it would be quite a while before I saw any substantial footage of that band performing. I bought the Minor Threat DVD when I was 16 or 17 years old, and I saw the clip of Tony that I'm about to share with you now. It's obvious that she's fully entrenched into this white male scene, but it's also obvious that she genuinely loves the music. And seeing this footage as a young person was honestly one of the first times I ever felt like I truly belonged somewhere. But DC is a really good starting point for what I want to do next, which is to talk about what it is like to be the only Black person in a punk band and what that can do to your frame of reference. Firstly, being the other. Punk by its nature is a celebration of the other, but Black participants are doubly marginalized, both for being punk kids and for being Black. Sometimes there are additional points of marginalization that exist within their own music scene. The band on the left is a band called Void, who are well known within the DC hardcore scene. Void were not from DC proper, but rather from Columbia, Maryland. Strike one. Void, unlike many of their contemporaries, do not dress particularly punk for the most part, at least in the early years, and rather look like typical teen boys you'd find in any neighborhood. Strike two. Their guitar player, Bubba Dupree, is a person of color. Strike three. Despite these forces working against them, Void have left an indelible mark on hardcore, both for being one of the most frenzied and chaotic live acts anyone has ever seen, but also specifically due to Bubba's musical contributions to the band. Void is known as the punk band largely responsible for making noise beautiful, and that has everything to do with Bubba's style of guitar playing. Feedback and other ungodly noises he was able to make with his equipment became just as sonically important to Void's songs as the notes he was playing. Bubba has influenced countless guitarists and punk bands right up until present day, and is also responsible for helping develop certain subgenres of punk and hardcore. The band on the right is another DC band called Scream. Unlike their contemporaries, Scream were handsome, from the suburbs, and could actually play their instruments really well. Incorporating melody and influences from unlikely places within their music, Scream were not particularly loved by the DC punks early on, but they did warm up to the band after a while. The band's bass player, Enoch Skeeter Thompson, was and still is a force to be reckoned with on stage. In the early days of the band, they would cover a Minor Threat song called Guilty of Being White, which is written from the perspective of a young white kid tired of being picked on for the color of his skin while growing up in the Chocolate City. And Skeeter would be the one to sing it. Even in the world of hardcore, shock value still has its place. Being the only Black person in a punk band means that you are choosing to be visible, engaged in an activity that Black people are not supposed, and I'm using air quotes here, to do. Some Black punks push these societal limits in other ways too. These days, it's not uncommon to see Black people skateboarding. Some of the biggest superstars in the skateboarding world are Black, most of them rising to prominence between the early 90s and now. However, in the 70s and 80s, skateboarding was largely understood to be something for white Californian boys with long blonde hair to do whenever they got bored of surfing. In the late 70s, skateboarders really wanted nothing to do with punk. They largely considered punk kids to be freaks. These days, there is a well-known and somewhat intrinsic connection between skateboarding and punk rock. The band largely responsible for this connection is a band called JFA from Phoenix, Arizona, pictured on the right. Before it was commonplace for members of punk and hardcore bands to be involved in skateboarding, this band, who were a group of skateboarders first and musicians second, discovered punk rock and decided to form a band. It's worth noting that the band's bass player, Mike Cornelius, is African-American. On the left is a guy named Chuck Treese. Now, the groundwork Chuck has laid for Black people's involvement in skateboarding is unparalleled as far as I'm concerned. Yet some of the deepest heads in the skateboarding world still do not know who he is. Chuck was a punk kid from Delaware living in Philadelphia who had his own hardcore band, McGrad. He also had a brief stint in the incredible New York band Underdog, and this picture is from one of their performances. In addition to being a highly skilled musician for his age, Chuck was a seriously good skateboarder. So good, in fact, that Chuck is one of the first African-American skaters to be sponsored and is absolutely the first Black skateboarder ever to grace the cover of a skateboarding magazine. It doesn't hurt that that magazine was Thrasher, absolutely the most well-known skateboarding publication ever, and one that is known the world over to this day. Chuck has gone on to live a life that I can personally only dream of. When he's not skating, he makes his living as a session musician and has released an impressive body of solo work. This is understandable because Chuck is a true virtuoso and can play pretty much anything. I have a video of Chuck from an early 90s program called Skate TV that does a good job of emphasizing what I'm talking about. Being the only Black person in a punk band means that you may unintentionally alter some of the messaging put forward by that band. On the left is one of the most widely acclaimed punk rock bands ever, Dead Kennedys. One of their most well-known songs, Nazi Punk's Fuck Off, was not actually written about neo-Nazi skinheads, but was about people who were drawn to the punk scene while maintaining fairly conservative politics. However, due in part to the band's Black drummer, D.H. Pellegro, the song ended up taking on a much more literal meaning. As the 80s went on, more and more white power skinheads became involved in the music scene, sadly, and they were none too happy about bands with Black membership. On the right, you can see John Dancy, drummer for one of my favorite hardcore bands, Urban Waste from New York. Urban Waste are best known for their song Public Opinion, which is about being tired of labeled a closed-minded punk rocker due to one's involvement in the punk scene. The chorus goes, "I'm not into punk rock. I'm not into hardcore. Don't try and label me, Public Opinion." I can't imagine that this was Dancy's personal experience, being a Black kid who was first drawn to arena rock bands like Kiss and ending up firmly ensconced in the New York hardcore scene. So being the Black front person for a punk band means that you have the opportunity and perhaps the expectation to speak your truth to what is usually a predominantly white audience. Pictured on the right is Eugene Robinson singing in his first band, Whipping Boy. He now sings in a band called Oxbow, which he's done for many, many years. To my knowledge, Whipping Boy's lyrics do not address issues of race. And in interviews, I have heard Robinson express not having a desire to discuss how issues of race affect him. Alternatively, you can see a man named Neil Perry pictured on the left. Neil adopted the stage name Jackal and sang in a band called Wide-Eye from Philadelphia. If you're familiar with the band The Misfits, you can think of Wide-Eye as kind of their distant cousin. Though Wide-Eye does not offer the same melodic hooks, the lyrical imagery of the band is similarly focused on the cartoonishly macabre, with songs about space invaders and monsters and werewolves and song titles like I Killed My Family and Murder is So Sweet. Wide-Eye definitely have a vibe. Despite this, Jackal still could not help singing about his very real experience as a Black man in the band. The song Out for Blood details police brutality, while the song Categorized specifically deals with Jackal's struggles as a Black man, simply trying to live his own life. Till the day I die, categorized, no matter what I do. Punk is largely, before I get into this, actually, I should mention that this is the section where I'm going to be using some especially strong language and offensive language for about the next, I'll say 2 to 3 minutes. Punk is largely a confrontational form of music, which I appreciate. And as a young person, it felt almost dangerous to be listening to a lot of this stuff. It was certainly thought-provoking, if nothing else. A lot of these bands incorporate ironic lyricism into their music in order to prove a point. And I quickly want to explore how this can be kind of confusing for a young Black listener. Please keep in mind that the singers of the next few bands I'm going to be talking about are all white. Pictured here is one of my favorite records by one of my favorite bands, The Kids Will Have Their Say by Society System Decontrol, or SSD. The song Jock Itch contains the lyrics, "Anyone different is a commie to you, anyone Black is a nigger to you." The message of the song is pretty straightforward, especially given the song's title. And while it's never fun to hear a white person say that word, it's easy to understand why they would do so within the context of the song. The Dead Kennedys are very well known for the song Holiday in Cambodia, which tackles a few different themes, really. The song contains the lyrics, "Playing ethnic-y jazz to parade your snaz on your 5-grand stereo, bragging that you know how the niggers feel cold and the slums got so much soul." Again, in this example, the choice for the singer to use this word is fairly obvious within the context of the song. And the lyrics are again addressing a college student, although a very different type of student than the one called out in the previous song by SSD. Now, in other instances, lines around this kind of lyricism become quite a bit more blurred. Stiff Little Fingers are an excellent band, in my opinion. They actually played Halifax just a few years ago. I saw them, they were great. But on their debut LP, the now legendary Inflammable Material, this Irish band have an anti-racist song called White Noise. The song contains ironic lyrics, first taking a jab at Black folks, then East Indians and Pakistanis, and finally the Irish, with lyrics eventually revealing the anti-racist intent of the song. However, the first verse is still a little hard to listen to. Rastus is a nigger, thug, mugger, junkie, Black Gollywog, Big Horny Monkey, Pimp Pusher Coon, Grinning Pickaninny, Send Him Home Soon, Back to the Trees. Lines become even more blurred with bands like Chronic Sick. And judging by the cover of this record alone, you can see that these guys are no strangers to shock value. One of the more controversial songs on this record is a tune called There Goes the Neighborhood, detailing the story of a white kid's frustration with his new black neighbors. I can't take it, mommy, I'm going for the gun. I need my peace and quiet, this ought to be fun. Wait a minute, sonny, don't you dare pull that trigger. Ah, come on, ma, it's only a nigger. The irony within this song and others of theirs is not as implicit as the band initially thought, and as a result, there are rumors to this day that this band is racist. If you do some deep digging, you can actually find fanzine interviews where the band specify the intent of the song and describe it as a send-up of bigoted people. But it's a shame that such digging has to be done to uncover the truth, in my opinion. Finally, the worst would-be offender of this is a band called Big Black, the brainchild of a musician I very much respect and admire, Steve Albini. Big Black's lyrics commonly deal with dark themes, and the intent behind this is to communicate the fact that all people are capable of horrendous things. All people, unfortunately, have a dark side. The band has a song called Seth about an encounter Albini had with a landlord in Chicago who claimed his dog hated black people. Right, his dog hated black people. The song begins with a sample from an automated message you could receive by calling the America First Committee hotline in Chicago, the America First Committee being an unapologetically hateful white power group. It's a long message I won't recount and is unintentionally quite funny, I have to say, but it's shocking upon first listen, to say the least. The inclusion of the sample in the song is once again to drive home the reality that people with beliefs like this actually exist. Seth is featured on the EP Bulldozer, pictured here. The working title of this record is Hey Nigger, and the artwork was going to depict a crudely drawn, grotesque man uttering the title within a speech bubble. The intention behind this was the same as the inclusion of that sample, but Albini's bandmates literally had to beg him to consider another title for this release. There are many, 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 many more examples like this that I could give, but the ultimate point I'm trying to make is this. I'm a huge fan of these bands, but as a teenage Black listener first discovering them, a lot of these lyrical choices proved to be some pretty large and rather confusing barriers for me to get into their music. I'm lucky I got into punk when I did, because if it had been the early 90s, I wouldn't have been able to look up any band information online or really uncover any info at all behind what was provided on a lyric sheet. So there are two music scenes I want to talk about somewhat quickly before I wrap things up. In a presentation like this one, I'd be remiss not to mention New York City in a bit more detail. New York, like DC and Philadelphia and London, all previously mentioned, had a larger than usual cast of Black characters in the punk scene, due in part to the population metrics of the city. The hardcore scene in New York didn't really blossom until the mid to late 80s, but when it did, a lot of really great bands came out of it. One of the interesting things about this scene in particular was that it was somewhat divided into two camps, and there were African-American participants in both. On the left is Chris Fist from the band Clenched Fist, an example of the darker, grittier side of New York hardcore. This involved bands like Urban Waste, who I previously mentioned, and Agnostic Front, who were from the inner city and were more exposed to some of the dangerous elements of New York at that time. On the right is the band True Colors. Now, this is an example of a wave of younger bands from the suburbs of New York and Connecticut who kind of forged their own more clean-cut scene within the existing one. So let's start with the Clean Cut Kids, or as they were more widely known, the Youth Crew, a musical movement that still exists to this day. There's a lot to unpack here, but to keep things short, I'll just say that these kids put their own musical twist on hardcore and also started taking a lot more of the ideals presented within the music to heart. Many within this particular scene are straight edge, which essentially means they don't smoke, take drugs, or consume any alcohol whatsoever. A lot of these kids are also vegetarian or vegan. It's worth noting how much this particular style borrowed from Black culture. A lot of these kids wore athletic gear as part of their look, which often included wearing Nikes, Air Jordans specifically. Some of the bands around this scene borrowed from elements of hip hop, not only in their music, but also stylistically, as evidenced here. The band Side by Side, one of my favorites, have made no secret as to where the inspiration for their record artwork came from. One of the most prominent bands with Black membership in this scene is the band Enough, who were actually from New Jersey, but heavily involved with New York. The band's lyrics dealt with topics very similar to their peers: betrayal, backstabbing, dancing hard, straight edge, and skateboarding. But this time the lyrics were being sung by a Black voice, and that is of the band's frontman, AJ James, so you can see here. To my knowledge, AJ is one of the first hardcore vocalists to incorporate rapping into that music. I identify with AJ a lot because he's a large Black man, often surrounded by white friends who are half his size, much like myself. It can be hard not to be self-conscious in a scenario like that. Being large and Black in these type of environments, people often assume that you are left alone, but this is not always the case. Often it just makes you a bigger target for people who have something to prove. The picture on the bottom right depicts AJ about to take it up with that shirtless guy who is a white power skinhead. Unfortunately, the tri-state area was rife with these characters at one point in time. I've been targeted by white power skinheads before, and it is not a fun situation to be in. Moving over to the grittier side of the New York hardcore scene, we have the band Absolution, fronted by Gingy Brown. Gingy quickly made a name for himself as one of the best front people in any band in New York at that time, evidenced by that incredible jump in the picture on the right. For what it's worth, Gingy is also the son of Marion Brown, a legendary avant-garde jazz saxophonist who has played with the likes of Archie Shepp and John Coltrane, and also boasts an impressive catalog of solo records. Gingy's transition into punk is a lot like that of the Bad Brains in this way, starting with jazz and then finding his way into harder-edged music. In James Spooner's Afropunk film, Gingy recounts the verbal abuse he took as a Black punk rocker, not from white kids, but from other Black people. It's important to consider how being Black and into this scene can alienate you from both the people in that scene and the people in your own community. It is very, very easy to feel lost and like you don't belong anywhere. Gingy's lyrics in the band's most well-known song, Never Ending Game, strike a chord with me for this very reason. For the future or for today, either understand me or get in my way. I believe that in much the same way the Bad Brains were influenced by Pure Hell, this man was influenced by Gingy Brown. This is a guy named Chaka Malik, who was a very big fan of Absolution. He would catch as many of their shows as he could and had a reputation as a particularly good dancer. When Absolution broke up, the guitarist Gavin Van Black approached Chaka about starting a new band. Following in the footsteps of Gingy Brown, Chaka picked up a microphone while supported by Van Black and some other great musicians, and started the band Burn, who still exists today and are keen to play shows again whenever that becomes a thing. Burn's music is extremely experimental and often borrows from jazz, even though they're a hardcore punk band. It's pretty hard to do them justice when describing their sound. Prior to starting Burn, Chaka was an avid showgoer and supporter of the scene, as I mentioned, and together with friend Freddie Alva, put out one of the most celebrated punk compilations out of New York, the New Breed compilation, and that's Chaka posing on the cover. First song on the comp, Never Ending Game by Absolution. I feel like going back to DC at this point, even though it was already discussed, because in the mid-'80s, there was a new musical movement that led to some new Black faces in that scene, a couple of which particularly resonate with me. As I previously mentioned, DC punk was an especially rough and tumble scene, and the violence it shows was getting out of control, partly due to skinhead morons who would come around to whatever show they could just to start fights. As a result, the scene began to dwindle as many participants started dropping out of it since it just wasn't fun anymore. A lot of the people who stopped going to shows were women, and the audiences at these shows started looking a lot less diverse. Something had to be done to retain the music scene these kids had worked so hard to preserve. And so, in the summer of 1985, a bunch of kids from DC got together to discuss what they could do to fix some of these issues, and they decided on a couple of things. One was that they were not going to slam dance anymore, and they were not going to fight anymore, ever. A shift in musical style happened too, in part as a way to enforce this new vision. Tempos slowed down, and the music became much less aggressive. It was also decided that DC kids would do their due diligence to address sexism in their scene wherever and whenever they came across it, in stark contrast to the way sexism and homophobia, I might add, was quickly swept under the rug during the initial wave of hardcore between 1980 and 1984. The summer of '85 was dubbed Revolution Summer for this reason, and some really awesome bands came out of it in the years that followed. Perhaps the most well-known of these bands is the group Fugazi, who began in the fall of 1987. On screen right now is a flyer for Fugazi's first ever show. If I'm being honest, they're likely my favorite band, but in this moment, I want to focus on the band Fire Party. As a pretty big DC punk nerd, I was intrigued when I first saw this flyer, as I was well aware of all the other bands on the bill, but I had never heard of Fire Party. Who were they? They are a band comprised entirely of women, and as I would go on to find out, one of the best DC bands of that era. Bands like Fugazi and Rites of Spring often are credited with being standouts from DC in the mid to late 80s, and I feel like Fire Party really deserved to be mentioned in that conversation. Fire Party's drummer was a young Black woman named Nikki Thomas. Recently, I came across a post of hers on social media responding to a post someone had made about Bubba Dupree from Void. Nikki simply stated, "No Bubba, no me," which again exemplifies how important it can be for Black folks to see someone who looks like us blazing a trail for us to follow. Although the DC scene of the late 80s had many more participants who were women or people of color, to my knowledge, Nikki Thomas is the only Black woman playing in a band within the scene at that time. Tony Young had sadly passed away from complications of pneumonia. Fire Party really never got their due in the States, but did find adequate success in Europe. The picture in color depicts them about to embark on a European tour, or perhaps just landing at an airport in Europe, I can't remember. This particular tour is one they did with the band Scream, and you can see a much older Skeeter Thompson kneeling down in the front. If you look just above Skeeter, you can see a very young Dave Grohl in the backwards ball cap, who was playing drums in the band at that time. And actually, if you look closely in Nirvana's video for Smells Like Teen Spirit, you can see that Dave's wearing a Scream t-shirt as a nod to his former bandmates. Finally, I'd like to take a minute or two to talk about Sean Brown. Sean originally sang in a band called Dag Nasty, but was kicked out, I believe for not being able to sing as melodically as the band would have liked. After this, Sean went on to sing in one of my absolute favorite bands, Swizz. Swizz sounds like a nonsense word, but it's actually a slang term referring to something that appears to be providing you with something, but in reality is actually taking something away from you. This is a pretty good encapsulation of the independent music scene for a lot of people of color. Swizz wanted to separate themselves from the other DC bands at this time, and they wrote music that borrowed a little bit more from the early 80s hardcore scene than their counterparts did. They also strove to be non-political, writing abstract lyrics for the most part and taking steps not to be lumped in with the straight edge hardcore bands they regularly played with while they were on tour. Because of this, it's ironic that Sean penned the most poignant and quite frankly life-affirming song for me personally dealing with matters of race while he was in Swizz. Like Jackal before him, Sean could not help but communicate his feelings as a Black person through his music, despite the overarching aesthetic of his band. So the song is called Tylenol and was inspired by a relationship Sean had with a white woman whose parents told him in no uncertain terms that they did not approve of the relationship because he was Black. It's really important to remember how recent this is. We're talking about the 1980s here. So what I want to do before I play one final video is leave you with the full lyrics of this song. There aren't many of them, and they say really succinctly pretty much everything that I'm trying to convey with this entire presentation. You don't even know me. You know the color of skin. If I could change myself, do you think I'd do it for you? You don't even see color. It's only black or white. It's only right or wrong. How can I be wrong? I wouldn't change who I am, even if I could. Swizz later reformed into a band called Sweet Belly Freakdown, which is where I stole my Instagram name from. And Sweet Belly Freakdown eventually morphed into a band called Red Hair, which I believe still exists to this day. So I want to play you a Red Hair video, and then I would love to hear any input from folks about anything at all. Very keen to have a chat. So I'm going to play that video really quickly and then come right back. All right, that about does it for me. If anyone has any comments at all, any criticisms, if you just want to have a conversation about anything, I would love to. I know that there might have been some comments in the chat. I wasn't able to see them because I was, as you can tell, I'm not the best with technology, so I was trying to go back and forth really quickly. But if anybody wants to start any kind of conversation right now, I'd love to have one.
I'm wondering if there are any, and maybe I missed it, maybe you did mention, I'm wondering about any all-black female punk bands.
That's a great question. And, you know, I'm sure that they exist. I personally don't know of any, but I did find out very recently through Instagram, full disclosure, there's a really, really great Instagram page, BIPOC Punk, right? So BIPOC_punk. And every day they kind of highlight a different musician, which for anyone who might be curious, that's really how this whole Black Dots thing started. I just wanted to post a few years ago in February, I just wanted to post a black and white picture of a Black punk musician every day and just type a couple sentences about them. And then some folks asked to turn it into a presentation. So that's really the only reason why it's here. But this BIPOC Punk page is amazing because they take that idea and they just do it literally every day, all year round. I don't know how long it's been going, but this is a long-winded way of me answering your question. But recently, like just maybe a month ago, I saw a post on there about an all Black, all female metal band, which I think is rad. Maybe what I can do is, I mean, hopefully you folks follow that page too and find it out for yourself, but I'll track down some stuff on that band and maybe send it to Bria. And then if folks are interested, you can send it to them. I haven't heard them yet, but I'm dying to. And yeah, I'm sure that there are all Black, all female punk rock bands. I just need to find out who they are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My question was, so one of the first, excuse me, earlier on you mentioned the reason, I think, I'm not sure, I forget the name of the particular band, but the all Black band that was that used to play jazz, and they were really, you said they were excellent with their instruments and with just a lot more skilled. So is not playing an instrument well, was that like the norm in punk?
Yeah, like kind of, especially in that first wave of punk in the late 70s, like the idea was like, you know, because especially in the 70s with all the excess and stuff, the idea was that like it was so unattainable to be in a band, because if you think of a rock band from that era, you'd think about like Queen or Led Zeppelin or something, like just this completely unattainable thing where they're playing these arenas and you would go watch them, but you would never think that you could do that. And the whole idea of punk is kind of to subvert that, to be like anybody can play music. It's totally about inclusion and accessibility. You can do whatever the fuck you want. So the idea is that like, even if you had never picked up a guitar before, you should just pick one up and you can start a band. And it really doesn't matter how good your band is, you should just be able to do it. And partly because of that reason, a lot of the like late 70s punk bands, like I'll say like 76 to 80, were really like did some really interesting things. Like there's a band from London called Wire, who are probably one of the strangest bands ever. A lot of the English bands are really experimental. Wire, Gang of Four, like a lot of bands who like some of the first bands to play like really super short songs, which now seems so, it doesn't seem like anything special because we're so used to it. But at the time, people were like, you can't do that. You can't play a 30-second song. And it's like, well, sure, we can do whatever we want. Or the band Gang of Four really incorporate a lot of funk elements into their music. And of course, punk is so white. I mean, I'm trying to prove that it's not, but predominantly white people are going to the shows, and Gang of Four are all white too, but they loved soul records and funk records, and they incorporate a lot of that guitar playing into their music. And they did a lot of other amazing things too. But anyway, there's tons of examples. But yeah, the idea was that like, you didn't have to be good. You should just do it because it's fun to do it. And I think the Bad Brains, exemplified that too, to a certain extent, but they also happen to be really, 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 really good. So people were just like, again, like there was this immediate kind of mysticism around them, because initially they're known as, people knew them because they were Black. Like people in DC who had never seen them would hear from a friend of a friend. And these are like 16-year-old kids. They would talk and just be like, did you know that there is a punk band in town and they're all a bunch of Black dudes? And that alone would have people be like, what are you talking about? That's crazy. Or that's unheard of. And then when they saw the show, there's other elements to it too, because, you know, the band is so good. People have never seen anything like that. HR doing those backflips in time with the music is just like, it's pretty incredible.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
kind of it was supposed to be more DIY, and then Black people-
100%. 100% DIY. That's exactly the idea. Yeah.
And then Black people made it excellent, and
that is what I'm trying to say. I guess I'll mention too, just in like, you know, please, if people have questions or anything they want to say, go for it. But just in the interim, I'll mention while it's on my mind that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the movie Afropunk by James Spooner, who I've gotten to know more recently, who's wonderful. If this presentation resonated with you at all, I'd recommend watching that movie. It's not exactly the same thing. You know, this presentation was more an attempt for me to try and tell the stories, you know, a little bit on each person, right? So it's more of like a somewhat more of a biographical or documentary kind of thing. Whereas a couple of these people are in his documentary, but mostly his film is focusing on just a lot of Black punk kids in the States, talking more about common themes that they've experienced rather than focusing on like certain musicians or things those musicians did. So most of that movie is him interviewing people who, you know, wouldn't be known on a national or international scale, but they're all Black and they're all involved in punk to some degree. So they all talk about obviously instances of racism, but so much more than that too. Talk about like, you know, introspection and what it means to be Black in punk rock, and is it okay for us to do this, and how it's affected their personal lives, their love lives, like people really coming to terms with themselves. And yeah, it's a really great film. I recommend people see it for sure. And then also the this band is a little bit more well known than a lot of people that I'm talked about, but I did mention that Death documentary too, a band called Death. If you enjoyed this presentation at all, I guarantee you'll enjoy that movie. It's a very emotional movie for me. And it's just an incredible story of that band, like not just three Black people, but three brothers, like literal brothers in Detroit, starting a band and just being told by everybody, and this is before punk, so they were really a rock band, but just being told by everybody that it was not okay for them to play rock, not only because they're Black, but they're Black in Detroit, right? So if you're not playing Motown, people just kind of think that you shouldn't exist. But anyway, they have an incredible story. I would encourage people to see that movie too.
That was actually going to be my question. Do you know who made that movie? Like off the top of your head? Or like what's it called again? Can you just say the name of it?
It's called A Band Called Death.
Okay. Because I love that band, and I was going to like, it's been on my list, but like many lists of movies that I want to see like over the course of time. So I'm glad that you mentioned it, because it reminded me that I really want to see that.
I promise you'll enjoy it. It's so good. And
that's awesome.
If we end up capturing a recording of this presentation, Bria, you might want to edit this part out. Let's pretend I never said it, but I'm pretty sure that full movie is on YouTube right now until somebody finds out and takes it down. So if you wanted to watch it like tonight, I think you definitely could.
Awesome.
Great. It's really, really great. Oh, I'll mention too that I forgot to mention this earlier. I love X-ray specs, and I only was able to capture some of Polystyrene's story, or Mariam Elliott Saeed, and I should mention that she died of breast cancer a number of years ago, but her daughter made a documentary about her mom that came out just a couple of years ago, and it was, she had to raise funds through like crowdfunding sources and stuff like that, but the movie came out. It's called I Am a Cliche, which is the name of an X-ray spec song, and I haven't seen it yet, but I am certainly going to. And yeah, if anyone on here likes that band or is interested, I can't recommend the movie because I haven't seen it, but I can certainly say that I'm really curious about it. Not only because it's about her, but literally her daughter made the film. So I'm assuming it's probably pretty good.
One thing I do want to say too, which I did say in the chat, is also like these images that you have are so incredible.
Oh, thank you.
And especially the ones, I think they're from Bad Brains, am I right? But there's like many where they're very obviously just like passing the mic to kids and stuff in the audience.
Yeah.
And I'm just like,
I
oh, I
love
wish I
that.
could be there. So hard.
I definitely, it's you know, Bree and I were having this conversation earlier when I was sort of testing out technical stuff with her and playing some of my videos. Like this, I think part of, you know, this presentation definitely has limitations. One is the fact that it only goes up till about 1990. It's like 1977 to 1990. So of course, tons has happened since then, but I only have so much time. And because of the kind of music that I like and the bands that I really like, it resonated with me. I focused on this time period. But of course, as a result, some of the video quality of this stuff is not so good. Like that Minor Threat video, which is that's a huge video for me with Tony Young, but the quality is not very good. But anyway, when I was putting the slideshow together, I was conscious of the fact that like some of these pictures are grainy and not so good. And I really want the slideshow to look really good. And luckily I was able to find those Bad Brains pictures, like especially the ones of them playing at that housing project. And yeah, those pictures are, you know, I can't take any credit for that, but those pictures are incredible. If you like those pictures, or if you want to know more about the Bad Brains, there is a book. I mean, there's many books just about DC punk, but there is a specific book called Dance of Days. And that's where those photographs come from. And also that is the book where I learned a lot of extra information about Bad Brains and about Tony Young specifically. So I would encourage folks to check out that book. Oh, and I'll mention too, like full criticism on myself, another major shortcoming of this presentation is that it's extremely regional, because really I only talk about London, New York, Philly, and DC. That's kind of it. And it's not as if there aren't important Black punk pioneers in other cities in America and in the world. It's just that like, I don't know about many of them. And I don't know, I guess just like, I'm not going to pretend that my musical taste doesn't inform some of this information. And I just happen to like bands from those areas. So I just want to put it out there that I fully realize that that is somewhat of a limitation. I'd like to do a bit better with that. But yeah, you know, I'm just putting it out there.
Does anybody else have any more thoughts or questions or sweet statements?
I wanted to say thank you, Chris, so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannah.
And yeah, really big thanks to Bria and Francesca for all of your organizing and care project programming.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much. Thank you for inviting me to do this. And again, like, thank you so much to everybody who is on the call right now and actually spent 2 hours watching this. Like, it means a lot to me that you would invest your time on this. I know, especially with the news today, like it's like, yeah, I'm at home, you know, but there's a million other things that you could do. And I don't know, it really, really, really means a lot to me that you would watch this. So like, thank you for real. I do appreciate it.
I have a question, if you can hear me. It's Anthony.
Yeah.
Great. You might, well, throughout the presentation, you were talking about different bands that historically have been really important to you. And I was wondering if there are kind of what more current, either Black fronted or Black inclusive bands that are like currently active that you're into or that you would recommend or you might want to mention?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to think here because I don't want to seem so steeped in the past, because obviously there are really great bands.
Yeah, sorry, I'm gonna put you on the spot.
No, that's really, really good. Yeah, I just need a second to think here for sure. Like, I will say that I was talking with someone about this recently about, you know, talking about like being Black and being into the punk scene in Halifax. And like Halifax obviously has a historically Black population, but I don't think people really think about, like if you were to think about the punk scene, especially in Atlantic Canada, you probably wouldn't think about Black people. But the thing that is interesting to me is that like, even though I felt, you know, alienated at shows, yada, yada, of course, there was always, not many, but there was always other people of color, like from the second I started going to shows. So, I mean, obviously I have seen Bria perform in a band or two. And even when I started going to shows 21 years ago, there was already a band that existed called Slight Return with a guy named John Samuel. That was probably the first ever Black person I saw at a show. But there's been lots of people. My friend Darren Arthur played in a band called Make No Gains. My friend AJ Bootleer plays in like 7 bands in Halifax right now. And there might not be many of us, but it is pretty cool to think about the fact that such a small, isolated place in 2021 still has like a decent, for the population, a decent amount of Black people who are making like rock or guitar-based music. Yeah, I don't know. I'll have that, my answer be kind of Halifax centric for now, but I do want to think of, I'll try to think of some other. There's a great DC band, an all-female band from DC called the Bacchae, that has a Black female member. I can't remember, and it's spelled Bacchae. They're playing Fest in Florida this year. Well, they're supposed to be. We'll see what happens, right? But they're a great band. And again, you can see I just love DC. I'm trying to get out of my regional limitations, but I'd encourage people to check out that band too. They've been around for a couple of years, but they definitely still exist. And this is, I don't know, I mentioned how much I really like Steve Albini. And of course, he's a pretty controversial character, and he has apologized for some things that he's done in the past. And, even though his art is well, not so much anymore, but even though his art used to be jarring, like the name of that Big Black record and them playing the sample of the white supremacist stuff, like it's disturbing, but like I like that he does it, because I do think that it's like people do kind of need to wake up and realize that hate exists in the world. But anyway, he still is in a band called Shellac, and Shellac aren't a new band. They've been around since 1992. But something that I wanted to, I didn't do it tonight, but something I wanted to add on to this presentation at a certain point was talking about when bands that are actually just fully comprised of white people talk a little bit about pain experienced by people of color, because I think that's a very controversial topic, because sometimes it comes across as genuine and sometimes it doesn't. And I think there's a lot of factors that kind of circulate around that. And I might be biased just because I like Steve Albini so much, but Shellac on their very first record have a song called My Black Ass. And of course, it's funny because none of them are Black. And the lyrics are somewhat abstract, but the song is 100% about like the struggles of being Black in America. And it doesn't, depending on who you are, you might think like, is this just paying lip service? Are they genuine, blah, blah, blah. And again, maybe I'm seeing it through rose-colored glasses just because I like the band so much and I like Steve Albini, but like, that's one example to me that seems more genuine. And if I thought about it, I'm sure I could think of some other examples of white people in rock music talking about the experience. Actually, here, I'll give an example. A video I was going to play, but decided not to, because let's not even go there. There's this European band, I can't remember where in Europe they're from, but there's this band called like Powderfinger or something like that. I can't remember exactly the name. They existed in the mid 80s. And they're a glam metal band, like they're super cheesy, like just very laughable band. And they have a song called Nigger, and it's on YouTube and you can watch it. And the whole, it's an anti-racist song. And like the lyrics are, I don't know, man. The lyrics are like, talking about people who are racist and saying, oh, well, you're the real niggers and things like that. And it's just like, it's super questionable and like very offensive to me, even though the underlying message of the whole song is like, don't be racist. But it's like, this, to me, it's a really fucked up way of saying it. And again, someone could have the same criticism of Shellac, but Shellac doesn't offend me. I really like it. So I don't know. I'm not articulating this well right now, but I think that maybe this presentation could do with a little segment kind of talking about that theme. I don't know if I'm making any sense at all, but that's just something I was thinking about recently.
No, it definitely makes sense. And like, you're right. I mean, like, as far as white fronted bands that I listen to, you're absolutely right. That talking about the pain of people of color from a white person's perspective is like a very rare thing. Like, I didn't even know Shellac. Like, I'm familiar with Shellac, but I didn't know they had that song. And I've never, you never really hear white people in general talk about that, or like having some familiarity or awareness of it. Really.
Yeah, absolutely.
But thanks for the recommendations. I'm definitely going to check out Buckeye and Slight Return. Was that one you mentioned?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Slight Return may be hard to find anything online, but slide into my DMs and I can find some return to send you. And I am biased, but in my opinion, easily one of the best Halifax bands, period, ever. I just think they're incredible.
Sick.
But that's just me.
I know I shouted it out in the chat, but I've got a lot of love for John Samuel's solo stuff.
Yeah, very talented guy. And he was in I don't really like Winter Sleep, but he was in that band for a while, just to give people some context as to who he is. But when I was a teenager, like 13 years old, going to shows, he was Slight Return was just kind of wrapping up. But anyway, if anybody wants to hear them, again, message me and I can send you some stuff. And I hope that you like it, because I think it's very, very, very good. But yeah, I mean, his solo stuff is amazing too, Sam. I fully agree. Very talented guy. There is a band, this is a little old now, like probably 10-ish or so years old, but if you want to hear a really, really great hardcore band, not only with Black membership, but a band that very specifically talks about the struggles of race in America, there's a great band, again from DC, called Pure Disgust that existed around 2010, 2011. Incredible band. The singer's name is Rob. I can't remember his last name, but he, Black guy. And yeah, like his lyrics are incredible, and his whole vibe of where he's coming from is definitely like, take a closer look at what it means to be Black in America, but also just a great band. So I recommend them for sure. I guess it's not that recent, right? It's 10 years old, but recent enough for me, I guess.
Any last questions, cuties, statements, thoughts?
I'm just really glad to have caught the workshop. Thank you, Chris, for hosting. Thank you, everybody who put this on. I'm really glad to be able to benefit from all this knowledge. And thank you for sharing and organizing.
Thank you. Thanks again to all of you for coming and checking this out again. It really, really means a lot to me. And if you want to continue the conversation, like if you had something you wanted to ask, or if you think of something later, I know a couple of you for sure, but my Instagram handle is Sweet Belly Freakdown, named after that band Swizz became. If you want to add me, send me a message to ask a question or talk about any of this stuff, I'm so open to that. So go for it. So Sweet Belly Freakdown. You can find me right away.
Amazing. Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for coming again. Does it feel okay to wrap up? It is 7:59 Atlantic time anyway. Not sure where all of you folks are, but how's everybody feeling?
Yeah, that sounds good, Bria. I should go help Stephanie put the kids to bed.
Oh yeah.
Tonight.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was incredible.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you so much, Bria. Thank you to everyone who came here. Thanks for hanging out. Please be safe. Thank you, Hannah. I can't see everyone's face because Chris, I see your screen, but it's really nice to see everyone. And we deeply appreciate that you attended. And Chris, we look forward to your next thing because people are keen.
There's interest and enthusiasm.